The study of cells is called cytology, but in human anatomy and physiology, you can't really isolate cells by themselves. Well, you can, but generally, if you're studying a human, you're going to be doing it in chunks. In fact, if you're going to look at a cell, you're going to look at it among the tissue in which it is embedded. So cytology has a lot of overlap with histology, which is really the study of tissues. And really the way that we study tissues, at least on a microscopic level, is by looking at the cells within there. So here you can see a slide of a tissue, and within the tissue you can see different types of cells. Now another branch then of histology is pathology, which is looking at the diseases, trying to study diseases. And one of the ways you can do that is by looking again at the tissue. So here we have some normal epithelium here, the lining of whatever this, hollow duct here is, or hollow organ that this may be lining. And then you have abnormal epithelium. So a pathologist would be looking under a microscope, maybe looking for cancer cells, and notice that something is wrong with this epithelium, and then based on the characteristics would be able to determine really what the abnormality is. So in tissues, we are really studying cells in groups, and of course we can categorize tissues into their different types. A tissue itself, however, is those group of cells. So again, expanding on getting into a higher level of classification. They have a similar embryonic origin and generally serve the same function, right? They're in the liver, a group of cells which are in the liver, which are all there to help carry out the functions of the liver, whether it's to store glycogen or to filter the blood and so on and so forth. Now there are 4 major categories of tissues and lots of different categories within them. They are first the epithelial tissue, which lines. Again, we just looked at a slide of some epithelial tissue. Lines inner and outer surfaces. We have connective tissue, which is important for supporting different parts of the body. We have muscles, which are obviously for movement, and nervous tissue, which is to communicate and coordinate the different parts of the body. The membranes then are not a specific type of tissue, but an organ made up of multiple tissues. So we'll also discuss tissue membranes after we go through these 4 different major categories. But we're going to start with epithelial tissue. Again, this is the lining tissue, either the outside or the inside of your body has an epithelial. So it covers, it arises from both ectoderm and endoderm, depending on where it is. It covers the body surfaces. It lines body cavities and ducts, and it also helps form glands, which then secrete fluid generally into an area, whether it be on the skin or in the intestines or so forth. The connective tissue arises from the mesoderm. It protects and supports body organs, binds organs together, and also can be to store energy. So adipose tissue is a type of connective tissue. Muscle tissue arises from the mesoderm. There are 3 types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. And it allows for movement, whether you're walking across the hallway, or also to contract, let's say, moving food through the digestive system. Finally, nervous tissue is to initiate, transmit, and interpret impulses that coordinate the body. It also helps to understand, where a body is in time and space. Well, in space at least, and coordinates responses to the external environment. Nervous tissue arises from the ectoderm. Okay, so we've seen this figure before with our different types of cells and their germ layers that they arise from, but now we're looking more at the tissues and where they arise from as well. All right, so tissue membranes then. Tissue membranes. A membrane is a tissue that forms a thin lining, and connective tissue membranes are where the whole membrane is made of connective tissue. These surround organs and joints, and also have specific types such as the synovial membrane, which is found in joints. It secretes synovial fluid. The other type of tissue membranes are epithelial membranes, and these have both connective tissue and epithelial tissue combined. These are the ones that line body cavities and hollow passageways, and they generally secrete something, either mucus or serous fluid, which is a substance to prevent friction from damaging cells. And then also your skin is an epithelial membrane. Okay, your cutaneous membrane is also your skin. All right, so now we're going to get on into a little more detail of the different tissues, starting with epithelial tissue. There are lots of different types of epithelial tissue, and the way that we categorize them is by their arrangement, which can be either a simple layer, a single layer of cells. It can be stratified, which has 2+ layers. Strata actually means layered. It can be pseudostratified, where that means falsely layered. It's actually a simple layer, but they're all squished around so it looks like layers. And then transitional, which is a single layer of stretchy cells. Okay, and then the second category would be shape. You can have scale-like epithelial tissue, which is called squamous. You can have cube-like shape, which is called cuboidal, and you can have column-shaped ones, which are columnar. When you put these then two together, you could come up with actually quite a few more than actually exist, but these are the ones that do exist. We have simple squamous, simple cuboidal, and simple columnar. So those, 3 is well represented among those. We have stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, and stratified columnar. We only have one arrangement of pseudostratified, or one shape of pseudostratified, which is columnar. And then transitional is in a category by itself. Okay, so you don't even see transitional on this this chart. But most of them are some combination of the different shape and arrangement. Now, each of these, again, their structure relates to their function and their location. A simple squamous tissue is for diffusion or filtration. It's a small, thin layer, so things go in and out of. Simple cuboidal is for secretion. Those cuboidal cells are generally producing something, which is why they're nice and thick. Columnar as well, absorption and secretion. Stratified squamous for protection. You have lots of layers. Stratified cuboidal also for secretion and absorption. Stratified columnar is really rare. And pseudostratified columnar is generally for secretion and movement of particles. So they often have cilia on them as well, which would be how it moves particles. And transitional is for expansion and relaxation. All right, so this then is a chart from your book which shows then our different tissues and also their locations and functions. So the general functions then of epithelial tissue, all of them serve as a covering or a lining and to form secretions or part of the glands. The characteristics of them, they are always closely packed together with very little extracellular space. So there's not a lot of fluid between them. They're touching each other. They're packed together. All of them have some sort of specialized cell-to-cell contact, which we have talked about before. Tight junctions, gap junctions, or desmosomes to help tie them together. But oftentimes they aren't, the only tissue in, or the only cell type within a tissue. So they're often connected to other types of tissue, specifically connective tissue. And in that connection, they have polarity, meaning they have, a top or a bottom. Okay, they have one end that is different than the other. They have distal and proximal ends. So the epithelial tissue is always connected to connective tissue at some point, and the point at which it connects is called the basement membrane. Okay, and you can see that in this little figure down here. The basement membrane is made up of glycoproteins from the epithelium and glycoproteins from the connective tissue. Those are called the basal lamina and the reticular lamina. Okay, so those then make the basal membrane, and that ties the epithelial tissue, keeps it in place next to a connective tissue. Epithelial tissue is also generally avascular, so there are no blood vessels going into the epithelial tissue. There is generally blood vessels close by, but not right there in the stratified squamous or whatever epithelial tissue is there. This causes that top layer to die and generally has to be regenerated, so they have a high regeneration rate, kind of like zombies. And that's because they have a lack of nutrients. So rather than keeping a cell alive, they just make new ones over and over and over again. And this also helps them to fulfill their purpose, such as your skin. So rather than if an infected cell is on your skin, rather than, fighting the infection, your skin can also just slough it off and grow a new one. There are also some specializations found in epithelial tissue that I mentioned. Cilia, this is found in tissue along the respiratory tract and reproductive tract. And it helps to move substances in and out. So in your nasal cavity, it's moving mucus. In the oviduct, it's moving mucus and or maybe sperm to the egg. There's also microvilli. Microvilli are these folds which increase the surface area and are found in areas such as the small intestines. There are also many different types of glands associated with epithelial tissue. A gland is one or more cells that secrete a product, something that's then expelled from the cell. There are two different types. Well, there's a lot of different ways to differentiate glands, but one of the ways is whether it produces a hormone released into the secretion is then part of the bloodstream, which would be an endocrine gland, or exocrine. It secretes a product that goes out to the body's surfaces, which would be like skin or into body cavities, such as in the intestines or stomach. So exocrine glands have different structural differentiations. One is the number of cells. So you can have a unicellular structural type, and this is just a single cell that secretes something. So a good example is a goblet or a mucus cell. They're just one cell that empties into whatever tissue it's next to or whatever lumen it may be around. The second one is multicellular. Okay, so these have lots of cells. So all of these to the right here, these are all multicellular. You can see it's definitely more than one cell. And they may have different shapes. They can be alveolar, okay, can see these here are alveolar and or tubular. So really more round shaped or more tube shaped. You can also divide them by their functions or how they actually secrete. American gland secretes their product by exocytosis. You see that up here. Apocrine glands secrete by actually part of the cell just breaks off. So that happens in milk. And then holocrine glands secrete pretty much the whole cell. The whole cell dies and that becomes the product. And oil glands of the skin follow that. Okay, so that's epithelial tissue. We aren't going to talk about the other tissues as much, but we will move on then to connective tissue. Lots of different types of connective tissues, but all of them have some similar characteristics, including our common embryonic tissue, which comes from what's called mesenchyme. So this is the proto-connective tissue. Before it's connective tissue, that's what it is. The cells are different from epithelium in that they are not packed together. They are actually far apart. So we have some cells over here, and the matrix, there's a lot of extracellular space, except in adipose tissue. The matrix then holds those cells in place. The composition of the matrix helps define what it is. It can be fluid or gel-like or fibrous or a combination of the two. That matrix is called the ground substance, and it can sometimes be solid, such as in bone. And it's also highly vascularized as opposed to epithelial tissue, which didn't have a blood supply. The functions of connective tissue are to bind and support, protect, insulate, and or transport. So in that way it's connecting two different tissues or two different parts of the body, such as in blood. There are three then categories of connective tissue. We have connective tissue proper, which is made of loose and dense connective tissue, supportive connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. And then we'll break it down from there. In connective tissue proper, we have loose connective tissue, which is defined by the different types of fibers it may have. Collagen is the most abundant fiber in the body. It is thick and white, this one up here. Elastic fibers are yellow and branched, okay? And reticular are more fragmented. So those are your three types of fibers. You also have a combination of different types of cells. You may have a mesenchymal cell, which we just stated was the progenitor cell of connective tissue. We have macrophages, which are part of the immune response system. We have a fibroblast, which secretes fibers until they become mature into fibrocytes. And then they secrete, for the formation of those fibers. You have mast cells, which are important for the inflammatory response, and adipocytes, which are for fat cells. You can see all those in this figure here. So the different compositions of cells, different compositions of fibers results in our different types of loose connective tissue. The first type we're going to talk about is areolar. Areolar connective tissue is often found close to the skin or within the skin, and it fills with fluid during the inflammation response. Adipose tissue is for nutrient storage. We have two types of adipose tissue, white fat and brown fat. Brown fat has a lot more mitochondria, and that's what gives it a darker color. And then our third is reticular, which has those reticular fibers within them. And here's a figure of that. Okay, so it kind of looks like, barbed wire kind of mixed through concrete sort of thing. All right, so those are our types of loose connective tissue. We then also have dense connective tissue, also called fibrous connective tissue. It contains a lot more collagen fibers in its matrix, and that collagen provides strength and protection. Regular dense connective tissue has parallel fibers, and that's what creates the ligaments which connect our bones, or the tendons which connect our muscles to the bones, or aponeuroses which attach muscles to muscles. And you can have these be stretched to some point, but sometimes they are stretched a little too much and they can break. But they can support quite a bit of force impact. Irregular dense connective tissue forms sheaths, things around your joints, such as around the knee joint. And that has fibers which go in all different directions. So whereas regular dense connective tissue has mostly parallel, irregular has it going in all different directions, and that allows it to withstand a force from any direction rather than just one. Our next type of connective tissue then is cartilage, which is a supportive connective tissue. It has a lot of matrix, and in its matrix, most of it is water, up to 80%. It is not very vascularized, doesn't have a lot of blood, and that also prevents it from healing very fast. So cartilage does not heal very fast if it is damaged. It does receive a blood supply from the perichondrium, which is a tissue that surrounds it. The cell types it has are called chondroblasts. These secrete the matrix fibers. They mature then into chondrocytes, which are mature cartilage cells that no longer secrete matrix. Okay. And so the answer to this question, at what stage in development would the chondroblast of a person stop secreting matrix? Well, once you become an adult, in the growth plate, cartilage is no longer made, so you wouldn't have any chondroblasts after you stopped growing. There are 3 types of cartilage. Hyaline cartilage, kind of commonly known as gristle in the meat you may eat. It's most abundant in the body, and it has reticular fibers within it. Fibrocartilage is mostly for shock absorption and has a very thick collagen layer, and elastic cartilage is more rubbery and pliable, and it has more elastic cartilage within it. And these are found in different parts of the body based on those needs. Do you need an elastic part where lots of movement is needed? Do you need a more dense one? So on and so forth. All right, our next supportive connective tissue is bone. The matrix in this one is unique because it is completely solid, and this is due to hydroxyapatite, which is a calcium phosphate. But it also has lots of collagen in there. Individually, collagen by itself or hydroxyapatite by itself would not make a good bone, but combined, they allow for flexibility and strength without being brittle. It is vascularized. You do have blood supply going throughout your bone, and the cell types are different. You have osteoblasts, which make bone matrix. They make new bone. You have osteocytes, which are mature bone. So once they're done making bone, they mature into osteocytes. They still have a more communicative role in bone function. And it is also where blood is made, which is kind of interesting. So the matrix in, we're still in bone. It's not mentioned here, but yeah, bone tissue is also where you will find bone marrow, where blood cells are being made from stem cells. Okay. All right, so our next tissue is blood. This is a fluid connective tissue. Its characteristics are it is mostly water, 90% water. There are different cell types, red blood cells and white blood cells, 5 different types of white blood cells, but there's also platelets. Okay, these are called erythrocytes, leukocytes, and thrombocytes. You'll get more into this when you study blood in A&P 2. But here is a microscopic picture of red blood cells, erythrocytes, and there's a big old white blood cell lymphocyte there. You can also kind of see, hey, there's a little black dot here. That's probably a thrombocyte or a platelet. All right, our next then group of tissues then is muscle tissue. All right, and we have our 3 types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. The skeletal tissue is, you can identify these fairly easily under the microscope. The skeletal tissue is striated, meaning it has, you can see it here, these striations or little lines running through it. And then it has these peripheral nuclei, and it doesn't branch, and so that's skeletal muscle there. The cardiac tissue is similar, that's down here, but it also has these branches coming off of it, and it only has 1 nuclei per cell. Smooth muscle is more shaped differently and all smushed together, but it doesn't have striations. Smooth muscle is involuntary, so you cannot consciously move your smooth muscle or your cardiac muscle, whereas skeletal muscle is voluntary, so under your conscious thought. The ratio of skeletal muscle to muscle cell to nerve endings is a 1-to-1 ratio. We talked about the attachment to bone via tendons or to muscles via aponeuroses, always associated pretty much with the skeleton or at least some sort of cartilaginous structural support, and they don't have gap junctions, so they're all under neural control. Cardiac muscle, on the other hand, is uninucleated, so they only have 1 nuclei per cell, and all cardiac cells have 1 nerve ending, so 1-to-1 ratio. These are only found in the heart. They occur in sheets and are connected by these intercalated discs. So this is actually a defining characteristic, these dark bars here. And this is a gap junction, which allows for communication between different cells within the cardiac tissue. Smooth muscle is uninucleated in a 1-to-1 ratio or all-to-1 ratio. It's found in the walls of hollow organs such as stomach, intestines, uterus, also in your blood vessels, in your ureter, urethra, urinary system as well. So gap junctions are also found in smooth muscle, and that's again to coordinate movement between different cells. So they can stimulate one cell and multiple cells will be contracting at the same time. All right, the last type of tissue is nervous tissue, and we will talk about the nervous system later on in the course in A&P 1, so we'll get a lot more into detail with this. A nerve cell is a neuron, initiates, transmits, and coordinates impulses through the body. So the stimulus generally goes from the dendrites or the receiving end down the axon, which is the end where it's sending the signal onto the next onto the next neuron, or maybe to some other effector cell. Okay. Axonal branches innervate other types of cells, and for example, muscle cells to excite them. But there are also other cells which are more supportive. So we have glial cells, which are important for, let's say, making insulative sheaths, which will make this signal transmit faster, or for immune function, or for creating a barrier between the blood so you don't get things you don't want around these neurons. Okay. All right, so that's connective tissue. Those are all our different types of tissue, and then the types within each tissue. We're briefly going to go over tissue repair. So what happens when a tissue is damaged? Well, the first thing that happens is the blood needs to stop. Yeah, if it's a vascularized tissue, you need to get the bleeding to stop. So there are clotting factors which are attracted to the site. A network of fibers will come and cover the site, and then a scab is formed, and that plugs up the hole that was there. So in addition to that, you're going to have a lot of swelling in the area, which is called inflammation. So inflammatory chemicals are going to be released. That's going to cause lots of fluid and white blood cells to be attracted to the area. It will generally be hotter and tender to the pain because that inflammation will put pressure on those nerve endings. But that will be a temporary state. So the next stage, that area where the scab was will be filled in with not the original type of tissue, but what's called granulation tissue. And granulation tissue will then cause angiogenesis, or the formation of blood cells, to occur. So you can increase the blood supply to this area to get more of the nutrients needed to repair. And so you'll still have a high amount of white blood cells, such as macrophages. You'll have fibroblasts in the area, which will create fibers, which will help create a supportive tissue. And then the width of the fissure will determine how much healing or how much regenerative tissue will then form. So the last stage is you'll have restoration of the tissue that was originally there, or you may have a replacement tissue, which would be scar tissue. Okay, if it's really close together, or you're able to maybe even stitch the area to make the skin closer together, then you're going to have a lot less scarring as if it was further apart. All right, and then that is tissue repair. That is it for tissues.